nobody really knows when this started in the Bigfoot community. Now, this is an animal whose presence, whose existence is anecdotal at best anyway. But if we add behaviors onto that have never been observed by anybody onto the Bigfoot, I think that's a really dangerous precedent that we set there. Now, what we should be doing, if we do think that sticks and stones and other things are signs of Bigfoot, is checking around the area for other signs of a large, heavy, bipedal humanoid in the area. Are there deep footprints around these large X structures? Are there any hairs around? Again, fecal matter. If we can establish that in line with the stick signs, then I think, okay, we've got some plausibility there. But at the moment, if you find sticks in the woods, it's only evidence of trees. Now, when I started investigating this phenomena in 2016, when I was writing my book, Beasts of Britain, I thought the British Bigfoot phenomena was it was like a mythical beast, like the Woodwows that I'd heard of, like the Green Man. I didn't believe there were any modern reports. I've heard one or two newspaper reports that were the normal Daily Star or Sun report of some strange and unusual creature that was normally, just some crazy person out in the country imagining something. And then I discovered this research community. I discovered this famous map full of all of these sightings and all of these different witnesses that were coming forward. And what they appeared to be describing was something that was similar to the American Sasquatch. Smaller, perhaps, between 5 to 7 feet, not as large as the Sasquatch, and somewhat similar to the Russian Almasty, which seems to have more of a Neanderthaloid description to it, yet still very hairy, very well built. And for all intents and purposes, it's a Bigfoot in everything but name. This is our phenomena, and it does have a historical precedent in our country. What it doesn't have is any evidence supporting its existence in the modern day.
I think it's about 3 years ago, really, when I first stumbled upon the article from, I think it was one of the daily newspapers, it might have been the Daily Star or the Sun that ran the article about the Welsh Bigfoot sighting. Might have been Jason Parsons, that one. From that point, I contacted Deborah Hatswell of the British Bigfoot. I didn't know that anyone, first of all, I didn't know that this was even a thing in Britain. How would I? And secondly, I didn't really have any idea of the amount of sightings that were coming in. Now, of course, I've done my share of interviewing witnesses, hundreds and hundreds over the last 13 years. And yes, you do develop somewhat of a sense as to whether someone's been disingenuous, because that's a key part of being an investigator. But for the most part, when I met Deborah Hatswell, her account is still probably the most valid, I would have said, of all the people that I've met. I mean, possibly because of the impact of it. But 2 years on, that interview and those witnesses, all that featuring Elucif, have fueled this movement. I think Elucif itself, I hope, gave people encouragement to get out into the woodland, to get out in parts of Britain. But for me, it had sort of the opposite effect. What I realised is when I looked back on that 2 years, I sort of saw all the flaws and the mistakes that had been made along the way. And yes, that is necessary in research. You have to be willing to look back at where you've been, and then you have to correct those mistakes. And one of the huge advantages of, be it a disadvantage, it depends how you look at it. When you hit that wall, and I think Andy went through this as well, when you hit that wall and you realise that there is no evidence. Yes, we have anecdotal sightings, some very good sightings, but ultimately, that 2 year period that I had been out and about, and I was probably one of the guys out there videoing and vlogging the most, I wasn't promoting the right things. I should have been talking about DNA and footprints and all that sort of stuff, physical evidence. Instead, I was focusing on some common misnomers, albeit the stick signs and glyphs and that sort of thing. Now, it's not to say that I don't think there's something in the sticks, but we're going to get to that a little bit later on in the film. So this film really is about Andy and I focusing on the sort of corporeal flesh and blood relic hominid theory. So in order to do that, although we have a lot of detractors, albeit those that don't live in Britain and those that don't really frequent, these parts of Britain, you have to do that research. You have to eliminate these areas. You have to be boots on the ground. So that's really why we decided to go to Scotland, because we had some amazing sightings from Scotland. Scotland's a quite a remote area, and so all the pieces sort of fit in that regard. So I think Galloway Forest seemed to be the perfect place for this research trip.
So the reason, Chris, we've come up here today is that Scotland is just 1.9% urban sprawl. Most of it's uninhabited. There's been footprints discovered in Galloway Forest Park very recently by Robert Shankland, and I think this is one of the most likely habitats for the British Bigfoot that we could find in this country.
I think last year when I interviewed Charmaine Fraser for the Elusive documentary, she was saying how similar the climates are in certain regions of Scotland to British Columbia, for example. So I think you're right in terms of habitat. I think this lends itself better to, let's say, the flesh and blood angle, which is primarily what we're investigating in this next few days, because, as you've said in the past, the supernatural woo angle of this whole phenomena is very difficult to investigate.
Well, if it's non-corporeal, if it's a supernatural being, then what is there to investigate? If something can jump into a portal or disappear back into a void, then we can't find it. But if something's flesh and blood, if it can leave footprints and hair and scat, then we can find something like that.
I think in regards to the American audience as well, which is probably a large percentage of the audience interested in cryptids is American. Obviously they'll have questions about the size of Britain itself. In comparison, again, I've said this in the past, that Britain is small, but only in comparison to places like Canada and Russia and North America. So what are your thoughts on how we tackle that?
Well, it's small by plane, but it's really pretty large by foot. So this is, if you're walking anywhere in this country, it's prime habitat. It's populated sparsely by villages and towns. We have large amount of rabbits and deer and sheep and all kinds of things that this thing could survive on. The issue we have is not really whether we have the habitat to support such an animal, but whether such an animal exists at all, and if so, does it exist here?
And I know over the last few years you've gained a network of friends, some of them very well known in America, with a lot of experience under their belt. What are their thoughts on the British phenomena of the wild man?
They're confused about the possibility. Now, the Doggerland Bridge theory, which has been proven that there was once a bridge connecting continental Europe with Britain, has been lauded by myself and by some others, and I think it's plausible. But again, it's just about establishing a possible connection. As far as evidence is concerned, footprints, hair, scat, we don't have anything like that. We have a large amount of anecdotal reports, and our American friends are intrigued by them, but not convinced that we have the evidence to back it up.
We're here at Galloway, which is the biggest forest in Britain, and in the hope, really, that what I guess our methodology is that we've always said for a long time that if it's a flesh and blood, so often have we heard that ramblers and hikers say, well, I've walked this forest and I travelled this one, I know that area very well. I've seen it. But we're talking about 400 square miles, most of which probably hasn't been covered by foot. So we're giving ourselves really the best chance by getting into the more remote areas of this forest in the hope of stumbling across a print, which is, we know, and we admit that it's highly unlikely that they're out there, but prints have been found in this location. By credible witnesses, actually. So I think we're giving ourselves the best chance. The weather's on our side for this next few days. So let's head out there and we'll see what we can find. So Andy, I know we share the same opinion about Scotland as a whole and as an ideal habitat, certainly similar to that of Canada. But when I come into these plantation forests, and even though Galloway is the biggest in Scotland, it just doesn't feel like the best place that the wild man might be. The reason I tended to come into these places over the years was to really look for a really strong piece of evidence, that being a footprint. Because at least with a footprint, you can send that off to people like Jeff Meldrum and get at least an informed opinion. When we're dealing with blob squatch, tree structures, we've got nothing. Nothing credible anyway. So what are your thoughts?
It's disappointing, really. And the reason it's disappointing is because, as I say, it's plantation growth. We've seen very little deer species around, or none actually so far. We saw an otter, saw a sparrow. We have seen sheep all over the place. This is the forest we're in right now. It's boggy. There's moss. The forest cover, even though it's quite young, kills everything underneath it. And you've got to wonder, like, Scotland has a large percentage of sightings that are listed as British Bigfoot sightings, but England has far more. And the places in England that have them are more open. They've got less forest cover. They've got more open grazing and possibly more accessible deer populations too. I'm starting to wondering about that. Are these creatures just great at hiding and staying out of our way? Do they need this kind of forest cover? And do we have a default in our mind that says, you know, Scotland is 1.9% urban population, the rest is empty wasteland. They must be here because we don't know what's out here. There's nobody living here. Instead of maybe they're closer to where people are and more prey species are, or at least easily accessible prey species.
See, I don't know whether I necessarily agree with that. I think the sightings in England, obviously more of them, but at the same time, back to some sceptical viewpoints that question the validity of some of those sightings. I guess they've got a point, because some of the sightings are very old, and in particular with Scotland, there's not many researchers and people taking those sightings. And for me, when people talk about deer, I feel personally that it's the sheep. Sheep would be the easiest form of food for a wild man, and we know for a fact there are tens of thousands of sheep go missing every year in the UK. Certainly much more easy prey than a deer would be, for example. But again, back to the forest, I just don't think these plantation forests are as good as what maybe an ancient piece of woodland that has various species of trees and plants and wild edibles. As much as the cover's fantastic in here, certainly remote, it just, to me, I think we would be better searching something a little bit more ancient.
And diverse.
And diverse, absolutely, yeah.
So I have to agree. I think the plantation forests are a no-go. It's too young, it's often boggy, and the trees aren't secure enough. Although it does block out the canopy, which blocks out the food sources below. I think a diverse forest, at least with some deer scat, some sort of sign of deer and other smaller mammals, would be good for us. Perhaps near a loch or near a farm where there are sheep. You know, if they do prey on sheep, they'll be looking for prey species. That might be a nice place to find some evidence of the UK wildman, should he exist in this part of the country.
The other thing that stands out to me about these plantation forests as well is quite the opposite of America, because they're not plantation forests for the most part, is that there are no tree structures in these forests. I don't think I've ever come across anything interesting in a plantation forest in the UK at all, whereas I have seen one or two. I'm not a fan of the tree structures and the stick structures, as you know, but I have seen one or two interesting things personally in the more ancient woodland and with the mixed species of trees and plants.
The lack of tree structures in a forest like this is because it's not good for bushcrafters. That's my theory. When we see tree structures, junior bushcrafters, children playing in the forest even, like we used to when we were kids, leaving signs for one another, and bushcrafting, an older, diverse forest has more time for things to fall into odd shapes. Stick signs or glyphs, stick markers, tend to be things like a large X made between two trees. Could be what we call a stick teepee, something that looks like a teepee or wigwam, sticks roughly placed together to make a rudimentary hut. something I call like a stick coupling, like a log jumble, everything jammed in together, and also small glyphs, perhaps things that represent letters or shapes that are left on the floor in a certain direction, amongst others. Now, the issue with these things is that they're often used as a marker or a pointer towards Bigfoot habituation. Nobody really knows when this started in the Bigfoot community. Now, this is an animal whose presence, whose existence is anecdotal at best anyway. But if we add behaviours onto that have never been observed by anybody onto the Bigfoot, I think that's a really dangerous precedent that we set there. Now, what we should be doing, if we do think that sticks and stones and other things are signs of Bigfoot, is checking around the area for other signs of a large, heavy, bipedal humanoid in the area. Are there deep footprints around these large X structures? Are there any hairs around? Again, fecal matter. If we can establish that in line with the stick signs, then I think, okay, we've got some plausibility there. But at the moment, if you find sticks in the woods, it's only evidence of trees.
In regards to the tree structures, I've made my viewpoint on that pretty clear over the years, the last couple of years particularly. That is one of the things that I tripped over early on in my research, is that every bent branch and every interesting shape that the trees that form into naturally became something that was done potentially by a cryptid or a Bigfoot. And that came off the back really of, that was what was being pushed in the forums, and that was what we were seeing in America. Now, yes, in America I've seen some really interesting things being done with tree structures and with different types of foliage and trees and branches. For the most part, what I found is that they're using the trees and the foliage as protection, whether it be a blind, whether it be as like an early alarm system, and that they surround seems to be the sites they're habituating with these trees, broken branches. They make it as difficult as possible for researchers and hikers and people, even by accident, trying to walk into that area. They're going to make such a noise trying to get through these structures, these blinds that have been created, and that it acts as an alarm system, and then they can flee should that alarm be set off by anyone walking through those areas. So that's an interesting use of the trees.
At one point, I also thought that the data needed to be collated and examined and to find out where the similarities were. But if the sources of the sticks were genuinely always the same, then the similarities would be the same, and therefore the collation of the data is null and void. Because if it's always human interference and forestry workers and bushcrafters and kids playing in the woods, then that's replicated all across the country. Except when we've been in Scotland, something very interesting has happened. In these really out-of-the-way woods, which are hard to access, which are boggy and full of water, we're not finding any stick signs because there are no people here. There are no people playing in these woods and camping and bushcrafting. And even from some parts of the gypsy community, they're not using this bit of land because it's very sodden and it's no good for them to camp on. So they're not leaving signs either. That, to me, that's a fantastic corroboration of stick signs. In this out-of-the-way, underpopulated places we've not seen anybody walking around hardly, cars and ones and twos, the odd person here and there, that there should be no stick signs. That's proof to me, proof positive that they're man-made. So what we're looking at over here is a black shape, could be an upturned tree root. There's a face-like structure on the end of it, which again could be exposed bark. I think that's a really good example of pareidolia. If we were to photograph this and present it on one of our pages, that could be argued about for months, but really what we should do is try to get closer. This is a prime example. What if I photographed that from over there? What if I'd used it as an example of something unexplained in the forest without a comparison shot, without getting any closer? Then we'd be arguing about this in the Bigfoot community for weeks and weeks to come, and all the normal excuses would be bandied around. There's a comparison shot, are you a believer? I see something there, I see a face, I see something different. But what we've got is a root ball of a tree, and there's lots of natural phenomena in the forest that looks unusual. The mind makes faces in clouds and in trees and in bushes and whatever else we can think of, really.
Andy, proportion-wise, what is the quality of the evidence like that's been put forward?
It's poor. I mean, quite frankly, it's very poor. It's embarrassing to the community. There's examples of pareidolia that we've just made here, a root ball with some bracken on top of it, a face in bushes, no comparison shot, no close-up, no next day appraisal of the situation, stick structures, tree fall, natural tree fall, and glyphs, rock piles, as we saw on the Loch beach today, that have been stacked there by people like, trying to leave their mark, left time and time again, and found by friends and colleagues in the community and lauded as evidence of something. Now, people are in the forest all the time, animals are in the forest, and the forest makes very strange shapes and very strange structures all by itself. Bigfoot doesn't need to help in any way whatsoever.
What is that discovery like? Did you feel a downer when you first got that?
No, well, I've been off the stick signs for a long time. In fact, I mean, in a sort of comical way, I've been referring to this to the people who are into these stick signs as wicker men for a long time. That's not to mock people following this phenomena, but just to say that it's actually apart from Bigfoot, and maybe that's what we need to be starting to refer to ourselves as. We're wicker men. We're not Bigfoot researchers. Now, when I first actually started looking at British Bigfoot research around the country, I went onto the different websites and the different Facebook pages and different social media around the place. What I noticed was this is just full of sticks, and I wasn't aware of this phenomenon. So I thought, why are there so many pictures of sticks and trees? I was an objective observer at that point, and what I saw was this looks ridiculous. It was only seeing the map of sightings, this great data resource, that brought me back in to say, well, actually, maybe there is something to it. Maybe these sticks are related to it. Since then, I've realized that they're not related at all. Now, there may be some evidence of stick signs that cannot be replicated physically by humans in remote places of the world, but they're not happening here. They're not happening here. Now, we've been to Galloway Forest Park today, and we've looked at lots of tree fall. You know, there's a granite base, there's spongy, sodden, shallow earth, and these plantation pines, they get a bit of wind and they fall. They fall into all different types of shapes and sizes. Now, in a diverse forest, an old forest growth, there's all types of sticks and stones in different shapes that appear, blown by the wind and fall together and get trapped, and the tree that actually it came from, this branch, is now rotted away, and that branch is stuck there. And there's so many explanations, other than these Bigfoot are bored in the forest and they're making teepees and they're making glyphs, and they're saying, oh, by the way, Bob, I went this way, here's my stick lean, and I made you a little glyph to show to the wife. It's sad, and it's a bit ridiculous too. So we've got to stray away from that now. If we do find out in the future that sticks are something, then I'd be happy to be wrong. But until that time, we've got to just throw them away and look for actual physical evidence of a 300 to 400 pound, 7 foot tall bipedal creature that I do not believe is a paranormal phenomena.
Andy made a really good point. How is it that all these tree structures seem to be where people habituate? The minute we drop ourselves into a place where nothing is going on, there are no tree structures. So no bushcrafters, no kids, no hikers, no travellers. No tree structures. The flip side is, you go into the woodland where there's kids, there's hikers, there's bushcrafters, and there's travellers potentially, poachers. You get interesting signs. But for the most part, this is nature doing what nature does. And as I said earlier, I think it's far too early to invest any time, into studying what little data we do have and were, especially when that time can be put into looking at tracks and looking at potential DNA. Andy, one of the reasons I asked you to come along on this trip to Galloway Forest, which is a 400 square mile forest in Scotland, mostly plantation, is to witness it for yourself and to sort of answer some of those critics, because you and I have been quite, I guess we've been a little bit harsh of late about the possibility of a flesh and blood Bigfoot in Britain. But one of the things we've never really been harsh about is the amount of landscape and land in Britain available for a wild man to exist. And the food, I think we've sort of silenced that argument amongst the sceptics. But what are your thoughts about when you hear those sorts of comments from people like, even from prominent hikers and wild campers that frequent Scotland, that say that they've covered every area of Scotland and they haven't seen the wild man? What's your answer to that?
Britain is a small island, but not if you're on foot. It's a long way if you're walking, and Scotland is a vast area. 4 million people, 1.9% of that percentage of the whole land surface is urban sprawl. Everything else is this open countryside. So, you mentioned that the skeptics debunk, saying there isn't the space for these things. There's the space, but that doesn't make it a reality. There's the food, and we've seen that, those animals. That doesn't make it a reality. What we need to find are footprints. We need to find hair. We need to find footage, if we could get something like that. And that's a very hard thing to do. You have to assume that if a creature has remained undiscovered all of this time, then it's going to be pretty adept at keeping out of our way. And one thing all rare creatures have in common is that they're rarely seen.
I think I understand the frustration from the sceptics, absolutely, because I think when you first get into cryptid research in the UK, there is that period of, so you get overwhelmed, don't you, with the sightings and this proposed evidence of the stick structures and etc., etc. So after about 2-3 years, what happens is then, I think what happened to me is you sort of hit that wall and the realisation that we actually have no evidence whatsoever. In defence of that statement, what I would say is that the movement is still in its infancy, and the focus has never really been on prints. If you've never ever noticed that, no one has consistently said, look, we've reached a point now where we can't take any more photographs of X's and sticks on the floor because they're a very weak form of evidence. What we really need is someone like Jeff Meldrum to take a look at the prints. So the focus should really be on collecting prints or hair samples. And because no one has been specifically looking for prints, me included, at least for the last year or two, because I've been busy with other projects, I think that this film, this short video that we're doing, might be an opportunity to push that agenda forward, and maybe in the groups, the social groups, we should push that agenda. What do you think?
That would be the most logical and sensible way forward, to take a scientific view of this phenomena. Now, if you're out in the woods and you see a large X structure, or you find a strange glyph on the floor, the next thing you should do is look for prints. Because if the creature is 300 to 400 pounds, by witness descriptions, it's very large and muscular, it should leave a trace of itself. Not everywhere, but most places. If I stood somewhere and erected a large pinwheel or a big tree structure, then I would see evidence of myself. I'd see my footprints, my boot prints. We need to have casting kits ready. Now, nobody wants to carry around a huge plaster of Paris casting kit. Now, you can get a very lightweight casting kit, which is just minimally expanding insulating foam, 2 pieces of cardboard and a paperweight or a stone from the floor at the location. Fill up the print, put the cardboard on top, weight it down, wait for 5 minutes, and then you have a lightweight, easy to carry print straight away. And in our climate, where we're racing against the weather constantly, that would be a really handy tool.
So fast forward 2 years from now, what happens and what conclusions can be drawn if we find no prints?
Now, of course, this would be a boon to the paranormalists and the woo crowd, but for me personally, it would just be a sign that we didn't do our jurisprudence. We didn't look at it scientifically. We didn't go out into the field equipped and ready to collect any evidence that we might find. We've got these creatures adorning our churches, carvings of them. We have them on our tapestries that are hundreds of years old. We even have them on the noble heraldry of our royal families in Britain and throughout Europe, and they're depicted as large, hairy men, sometimes depicted as very man-like, sometimes as very ape-like in some ways, covered in hair, grey hair often, brown hair, depicted carrying off maidens, being fought with by knights and brave men rescuing, people, rescuing the village from these particular creatures. And I think it's got to relate to something. These particular mythical beasts didn't come from out of nowhere. They weren't depicted in a way that so closely matches our modern day Bigfoot accidentally. Now you could imagine that perhaps we've based modern day Bigfoot sightings upon these ancient folkloric mythical creatures, or that it's a direct corroboration from history as to what we're now describing and seeing in our own land.
Is it pure coincidence that every other culture has a green man, a bogeyman, often that steals and kidnaps women and children and takes them into the caves, never to be seen again? That mythology comes from somewhere. This is not made up. This is not the in my opinion, the green man, particularly in Britain, I think that is a little bit sketchy in regards to the green man, the nature spirit. However, the stories of the upright bipedal hairy creatures stealing children and taking them into caves, this is not the nature spirit, and nor is it an old wife's tale to frighten the children to keep them out of the woods. The children needed keeping out of the woods for a valid reason, in my opinion. And it's no coincidence that this is happening all over the world. These sorts of stories, always with the same description of these upright bipedal hairy hominids, primates, or whatever they were, whatever they are. I just think it's not a coincidence that.
Many, but not all, researchers into cryptids often share an interest in other alternative viewpoints. Is that relevant in this discussion?
It's relevant, but I think I've got quite an inside view on this paranormal Bigfoot phenomena. Now, I'm quite a religious person, and I study religion for my degrees. So what I'm very aware of, actually, is how the religious mind operates, how it places relevance and importance onto what it chooses to believe in, what it chooses to champion in its life. So as a religious person, I might say, God, if I'm supposed to get this job, make it rain tomorrow. And then it rains, and I get the job, and it was meant to be. Well, those are very coincidental factors. Maybe 100 other people prayed for rain too, for the crops and to get out of work and all these different things. And yet I placed my desire, onto that religious principle and then attributed it to a divine power. Now, with the paranormal Bigfoot, I think what happens is people, in the absence of corporate religion in our society, still have a spiritual hole, and they try to place pseudo-spiritual beliefs onto other phenomena. With Bigfoot, it's because it's elusive, it can't be found, and therefore you can call it what you want it to be. Bigfoot is whatever you want it to be in that case, and you can't find it. Why? Because it goes into portals, it's paranormal, it comes from spaceships, it can't be found, it dematerializes, it cloaks, it speaks to you with its mind. All of these things you can read ambiguous data into as a sort of proof. I left apples out for Bigfoot because I'm habituating a site. I came back and the apples were gone. I thought I saw a shadow in the trees, but when I got there, it disappeared. There must be a portal. Now, there are, from my particular belief structure, spiritual phenomena in this world, so I'm not denying the possibility of spiritual beings, but I think most of the attributes we see this particular creature display, like chasing and hunting deer, like foraging for berries, don't really belong to a ghostly creature. Ghosts and paranormal creatures and aliens, they don't seem to have any need for our type of sustenance, but this creature does. It's found where there are water sources, where there's food in abundance, and where there's cover. Why would a paranormal creature need such a thing?
So even though this trip was, a trip about finding, answering the questions about the sticks for one, and secondly, we're looking for DNA and footprints in remote areas. The other angle was primarily the flesh and blood argument, and I understand why. Because I'm one of them, I understand why a skeptic would attack that. The flip side of that, I also understand why a skeptic wouldn't want someone to cry, oh, well, Bigfoot must be paranormal then. Because if Bigfoot's paranormal, then there's absolutely no way that you can disprove that. So I get why people don't like that angle, but ultimately, I've been in and around this subject now for 13 years, and I've spoke to a lot of witnesses, a lot of great researchers, and there are places in Britain, places all over the world, in fact, where there are a lot of correlations that the flesh and blood crowd do not want to discuss. Let's take two places that I'm familiar with, which is, let's take Skinwalker, let's take three places. Let's take Skinwalker Ranch, let's take Rendlesham Forest, and let's take Brampton. All those places, cryptids have been seen. It just so happens that in all those places, UFOs have been seen, light anomalies have been seen, and there are other correlations in there, but I won't throw in there. I'll let other people make their own minds up on the other phenomena happening in those places. But to say that that's coincidence and to not look at that, I think that is a mistake, and I think that's sometimes why people looking down the flesh and blood angle get to a point where, as far as they're concerned, these things don't exist. That I don't think that is doing justice to yourself. I think there are a lot of. I think it's a matter of time. Just give me a little bit longer with Andy, and I'm going to try and. He won't agree, but give me a little bit longer to spend with Andy, and we'll see if we can find out something interesting. We're going on a couple of filming trips this year together. And who knows, we're going into some areas that are very interesting. So you never know what's gonna happen. There are a lot of times on this journey where your mind has been changed and your opinion changes. And for the most part, I don't want it to come over in this film that we're poo-pooing the whole idea of the existence of the British Bigfoot. We're really not. Even though Andy can be quite critical in his analysis, I think all he's doing is laying out the facts as they are. I think don't be too disheartened by that, because just remember, Andy and we were disheartened when we did that. It's a very uncomfortable thing to do when you look at where you've been and what you've got, and it turns out that you've got nothing. What we have in abundance is sightings, and as long as the sightings are there and as long as the witnesses are credible, then we have something to investigate. And everyone has to take their own path on this, and if it's the scientific academic flesh and blood angle, cool. If it's the woo batshit crazy angle, well, that's cool too. So let's see what this year turns up.
When I started seriously looking into career cryptozoology in 2016, when I decided to write a book and film a TV series and I was going to make it my career, I think I embraced supposed evidence too eagerly. I didn't question enough. I believed the witness without question. I didn't question people's motives. I didn't question people's backgrounds. Now, that's not something you should do to the face of your witness, but you should always be looking out for red flags. Multiple sightings, mental health issues can be a situation for some people. Does the person regularly seek attention through forums and different Facebook pages for their work and their research? These things seem quite obvious, but when you're eager for sightings, when you're eager to find evidence of what you're looking for, you're willing to accept even the most extreme claims, for proof, without much investigation. What I would suggest for anybody investigating this phenomena now is trying to reference as many sources as possible. read books. Don't look at YouTube clips and internet evidence. Find good authors on the subject, good established authors, especially if they have zoological PhDs, people like Jeff Meldrum, Todd Disotell, and others that really have researched this phenomena and have a scientific background, and see what they've come up with, see what the general accepted evidence is, and then look into your own area, look into the research in your own backyard, like in the UK, and see what people are presenting in juxtaposition to that evidence.
I've been lucky over the years in that I've been able to work with really prominent researchers and surround myself with people that are hard-working, boots on the ground type of researchers. And that's not to say that online research isn't as difficult. I mean, it is. That you can spend your life online researching in archives. And it plays its part. But ultimately, for a cryptid documentary or a cryptid research, you have to be boots on the ground. And I've spent a lot of time with Paul Sinclair, who's a boots on the ground researcher. And there's probably no one really put as much work in on the ground anyway, looking in using old school methods. And that's where I get. They're great mentors for me, actually. People like James Bartley from ufology, who's a great researcher and experiencer, and he runs his own podcast called Cosmic Switchboard. Ellis Taylor, being around these type of researchers is only good, because when you go off on your own and you develop your own styles, that's all very well, but you're taking along your own bias, and we have to be aware of that. I think Andy will second that. Andy's got a religious background. He's quite academic, so therefore his bias falls on the side of that, as in, I guess my background's ufology and alternative media, so my bias would be supernatural, paranormal. I guess that's a get out of jail card free for some of the skeptics out there, but that's the reality of the situation. But we're both aware of our biases, and I think surrounding yourself with the right type of people, skeptics if you like, and people with opposite mindsets, can be very good for a researcher. And sometimes what you get out of those relationships, it isn't always great, because you have to confront some of your own. You have to confront those biases and accept that you might be wanting to believe this just a little bit too hard. If you're a witness, that's a different kettle of fish, because you've seen what you've seen. For a researcher, yes, we want to believe it, but we have to be careful just how hard we push these things.
I was a believer. I would say that I wanted to believe that there was a British Bigfoot. And initially, when I started researching this phenomenon in 2016, I had no idea about British Bigfoot reports. That's how under-researched and how scarce that the whole genre was on the UK scene. What I feel now, these days, actually, is that being a believer is a hindrance to actual scientific study of these types of hidden animals. One thing that all rare animals have in common is that they're rarely seen. And to be a believer obfuscates any evidence to the contrary of what I want to be a reality. So, no, I'm not a believer anymore, but I am a hopeful skeptic.
I don't think anyone wants to hear that researching the British Bigfoot is a long, drawn-out process. That's the fact of the matter. The reality is that until you get enough researchers on the ground, collating data, sharing witness sightings, having their data critiqued, and that's every one of us, then we haven't really got a case for a corporeal flesh and blood relic hominid in this country, in Great Britain, other than the anecdotal sightings. Now, my belief is that I do believe there is something out there. I want to make that clear. I think everybody that knows me knows that anyway. And I think there's a part of Andy actually that believes that. I think we both. What happened is we both hit that wall quite close together and came to the realization. And it's uncomfortable when that happens. So this film was really about answering those questions. And I think, you know, spending a few days in one particular site in Scotland does not rule out anything. That's another thing that we want to say. If you're going to really investigate Scotland, and this goes to all the hikers out there that talk about that they've walked every inch of Scotland, absolute nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. But to do Scotland justice, it would take hundreds of trips into the wilderness, into these remote areas, into these forests. So yes, the data that we came back with from this particular trip looks to be a little one-sided at the moment, but you know, that's all we have. But what we're saying is that we will be going back, and if that changes, we'll be, you know, of course we're going to talk about that and let everybody know our thoughts on that. But ultimately, we're doing this for ourselves. It's not really for anyone. Well, I am. This is purely to answer questions to myself, and to get the movement moving again. I think there are a lot of people still working really hard. The British Bigfoot thing's still going. Everyone's out there doing about it. But in terms of researchers on the ground, there might have been a small increase in number, but I think that's dipped. And I think if we can push that, what we need to do is probably come up with some method of getting this thing momentum again. I think it might have lost a little bit of momentum. I haven't been as proactive as I would like to have been. I know other people have still been doing their bit, which is cool. But this year should be an interesting one in terms of cryptid research in the UK for Andy and I.
So where do we go from here? I think we need a team of citizen scientists, people who are equipped and ready to collect evidence and not contaminate it. Sterile collection kits and an eye for detail. If somebody sees an anomaly and they go to investigate it, then they need to look for footprints. They need to look for hairs, fecal matter. They need to look for even animal bones or evidence of some type of food source, and make a note of that. You know, make a database and share that with the wider community. Each researcher is not an island in itself. They have to share this information if we're going to come to the bottom of what we're dealing with here.
I think the idea of a British Bigfoot over here was peaking during that. I think halfway through the making of Elusive, I think, you know, people were interested and intrigued by that. But at the same time, it was taking a bit of a hammering online and in the forums from all sorts of skeptics, and particular people in the US and Canada that claimed Britain was just too small. Now, I understand that. I do. You know, having travelled a lot over the last 3 years around Britain into different research areas. However, I think it's one of those arguments that can't be settled until the ground is walked. And I think if you live in Britain and you frequent particular places like Scotland, I mean, it's huge. The areas of remote land in Scotland is enormous. So, yes, this trip was primarily about the corporeal angle, whether there was a relic hominid still existing in Britain. And that's really primarily what we were focusing on this trip. Going forward, my intention is to try and push Andy into a more uncomfortable zone for him, because Andy's quite academic. His background's academia and religion. My background's primarily corrupt governments and ufology. So interesting that we have two different ends of the spectrum, if you like. But I think you need that to do anything justice. Two heads are better than one. You know, when you come in at things with bias, that's a problem, and that's something we're both aware of. So I know that I tend to be a little bit go down the woo angle a little bit too prematurely, and vice versa for Andy. It's something Andy's not interested in that angle at the moment anyway. He doesn't rule it out entirely, let's be clear about that, but he's just not ready at this moment in time to go down that avenue. But I'll get him there.
Come close, come close.
So it's not a crime to upload a blurry picture, it's not a crime to upload a picture of sticks. It's just not very useful. And let's be honest, if we look back at some of the internet groups, if I look back at my page, my catalogue of YouTube uploads, for example, I'll be there talking about stick structures. But this is the point, I've come to that point now where you have to be more objective. I'm not scared of admitting that I've made mistakes in researching these topics. That's the nature of the beast, unfortunately. Particularly when the scientific method is being proposed as the only way. It's not the only way, but it's the best way.
Did I look arrogant enough when I said that last bit? Because I was really going for it there. Sorry.